When the Royal Commission into Robodebt was first announced, this is what Peter Dutton said.
I presume the terms of reference will include Labor's time in the portfolio when this situation first started. Of course, if it's not, then it's clear that this is nothing more than a political witch hunt.
That's Peter Dutton, the Liberal opposition leader, calling the Royal Commission a witch hunt and saying that Labor started Robodebt. That's a common coalition lie.
But Bill Shorten should be the first witness at the inquiry because he set Robodebt up. He was the one that set up the data matching that was the day one of this operation.
In reality, Robodebt was the unlawful scheme created by the coalition government in 2015. Over the next few years, the scheme collected non-existent debts from hundreds of thousands of Australians. It was described by a federal court judge as a shameful chapter in the administration of the social security system and a massive failure of public administration. The ministers involved were all colleagues of Peter Dutton, and the Royal Commission exposed the truth of who was responsible and how this unlawful scheme was allowed to go on for years. So, of course, Peter Dutton was always going to be against the Royal Commission.
One thing you know about people like Dan Andrews and Anthony Albanese is they've been around a long time. They know lots of tricks in the book, and you're seeing it now with the announcement of a Royal Commission into the Robodebt. Again, a witch hunt.
The Royal Commission, headed by former Judge Catherine Holmes, handed down its report on the 7th of July 2023. The report is over 1,000 pages long. The Commission had almost 1 million documents produced by the government and held public hearings with 115 witnesses giving evidence. It's safe to say this was a huge task in a relatively short time frame. I've been covering the public hearings, releasing videos detailing the key takeaways, and the evidence has been shocking. I've got a few more summary videos to go, and once that's done, I'll do a deep dive into the Royal Commission findings. But I wanted to briefly go through some of the things that stood out to me in the report. The Commission summarised the failings by saying that it was remarkable how little interest there was in ensuring the scheme was lawful. It said it was truly dismayed with the amount of dishonesty and collusion that prevented the lack of legal foundation from coming to light. It also found that the various government bodies which are supposed to protect the public, like the Commonwealth Ombudsman or the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, failed to stop the scheme from continuing. The report found that Robodebt was a crude and cruel mechanism, neither fair nor legal, and it made many people feel like criminals. In essence, people were traumatised on the off chance they might owe money. Now, one of the things the Commission was tasked with was to determine who was responsible for the development of Robodebt. It found that data matching had been around for decades, starting in 1991. But data matching being used to find discrepancies isn't the same as Robodebt. Before Robodebt, if a discrepancy was identified, the compliance officers would investigate further and a debt notice would only generally be sent out if there was actual evidence of an overpayment. With Robodebt, the onus of proof was put on recipients to come up with evidence that they didn't owe a debt. If the recipient didn't respond or couldn't find the right information, an unlawful assumption was made, called income averaging, and a debt was created without any actual evidence. This new concept only started being developed in 2014 by the Department of Human Services. And the reason this scheme was developed was because the government, and specifically Scott Morrison as the Social Services Minister, demanded savings and tougher action against Social Security recipients. These are inconvenient facts for Peter Dutton and his mates who've been trying to push the myth that Labor started Robodebt. The report goes into a lot of detail about all aspects of the scheme and the massive cover-up that allowed it to go on for so many years. It also looked at the impact on our society and economy more generally. The scheme was estimated to have cost the budget over $500 million, and that doesn't include the $746 million of debt payments the government had to refund. Now, I was very interested in reading about what adverse findings were made against those involved. Unfortunately, the really hard-hitting stuff is in a chapter that hasn't been released to the public. This sealed chapter contains the Commission's recommendations for civil action and criminal prosecution against various individuals. We don't know who those people are and what they're being referred for. But we will no doubt see some of this come through if charges end up being laid, or if people are terminated from their roles. I don't fully agree with having this chapter hidden away, because our justice system moves very slowly and sometimes doesn't work very well. So we may never know what recommendations were made against people who really shouldn't be sitting in Parliament or the public service. But the reason for this secrecy is to avoid compromising any civil action or criminal prosecution. That all being said, there is plenty in the report that has been released publicly, and we have already started to see consequences for those responsible. Catherine Campbell was the most senior public servant involved throughout Robodebt. She was the Secretary of the Department of Human Services and then later Secretary of the Department of Social Services. The Commission found that she had been responsible for the department that had established, implemented and maintained an unlawful program. When exposed to this illegality, she did nothing of substance. A few days after the report was released, Catherine Campbell was suspended without pay. Not long after, she quit her role, probably to avoid being formally fired. Then there was the firm PwC. They were engaged by the Department of Human Services to do a detailed report into Robodebt. The report would have outlined how flawed the scheme was, and for this, they would charge almost $1 million. Turns out, this report was never provided to the department. Instead, they did a PowerPoint presentation, but still cashed in on their fees. After the Royal Commission's findings came out, PwC said that they would refund the government the fees they had collected. So what about some of the politicians? Alan Tudge was the Liberal Human Services Minister when Robodebt was really ramping up and criticism was flooding in. The Commission found that instead of doing something about the issues, Alan Tudge engaged in a media strategy to undermine the credibility of complaints about flaws in the scheme. His use of information about Social Security recipients in the media represented an abuse of power. A few days after he gave evidence at the Royal Commission, Alan Tudge resigned from Parliament. Scott Morrison was the Social Services Minister who introduced Robodebt to Cabinet and was involved with the scheme all the way to the end. His evidence at the Royal Commission was extraordinary, and it's no surprise that the Commission found that parts of his evidence was untrue. It also found that he had allowed Cabinet to be misled about the nature of Robodebt and failed to meet his ministerial responsibilities. Despite this, Scott Morrison still sits in Parliament, with Peter Dutton happy to defend him. More on this later in the video. And the last person I want to highlight is Stuart Robert. He was another Liberal Human Services Minister, around the time Robodebt was starting to collapse from federal court cases and a massive class action. The Commission found that he was making statements as to the accuracy of Robodebt, even though he knew those statements could not be right. In other words, he was lying to the nation to try and keep the program going. Not long after giving evidence at the Royal Commission, Stuart Robert disappeared from Parliament and then resigned. With such a damning report, the reaction from the Liberal Party has been, well, predictable. Here is Peter Dutton, a few days before the report was due to be released.
The government obviously is playing, tricks and funny games, milking all they can out of the Robodebt inquiry. They're going to dump that inquiry finding a week before election day. There's no coincidence in that.
This was his attempt at shifting the narrative to somehow make this about Labor. It was Labor apparently timing everything to impact the by-election caused by the resignation of Stuart Robert. And that narrative continued, even on the day the report was released.
There's no question about why it's being dropped today, because we're a week out from the by-election in Fadden, so the government's trying to squeeze every political drop out of it.
That's right. The issue here isn't the findings and the failures. It's Labor politicising things. Which, first of all, of course they are, as they should be. This report needs as much attention as it can get. But I want to call out this nonsense that the timing of the Royal Commission report is some sort of conspiracy for the Fadden by-election. Labor knew it was never going to win that seat, and that it wouldn't have made a difference in Parliament anyway. Swollen Pickles did a good video on this, which I'll link to. But aside from that, the timeline of Peter Dutton's theory doesn't stack up. In August 2022, the newly elected Labour government established the Robodebt Royal Commission. It was instructed to deliver its report by the 18th of April 2023. It soon became clear that more time was needed because hundreds of thousands of documents were being produced and numerous witnesses were being called to give evidence. So the Commission requested an extension of time, and in February 2023, it was announced the new reporting date would be the 30th of June. Now at this point, Stuart Robert hadn't even given his disastrous evidence, let alone resigned. The idea that Labour was conspiring with an independent Royal Commission to extend the reporting dates makes no sense, because there wasn't even the prospect of a by-election. On the 11th of May 2023, the Commission asked for its final one-week extension. The reporting date would now be the 7th of July. This extension was requested so that referrals could be made to the new National Anti-Corruption Commission, which began operations in July. But even this one-week extension happened before Stuart Robert had resigned. He resigned a week later, on the 18th of May, and this is what finally triggered the by-election. Basically, the timeline doesn't support this fake narrative by Peter Dutton, who is desperately trying to deflect from the Robodebt findings. It's not like this is surprising, given his other recent attempts at deflecting Liberal Party accountability.
And she's not a corrupt person.
It's clear that Peter Dutton was worried about the by-election, enough to make up an alternative narrative that there was some sort of conspiracy happening with the Royal Commission. And that's because, if the Liberals had lost, he probably wouldn't have remained as leader for very long. And minimising the findings of the Royal Commission is shameful, but that's the path Peter Dutton has decided to take. Here he is, minimising the findings against Scott Morrison, who continues to sit in his party.
Scott's, in relation to the Robodebt inquiry, he's issued a statement and he's refuted some of the findings that have been drawn, and he's pointed out that it's contrary to some of the evidence that was given. That can be tested, but I'll make this important point, Ray. We live in a country where you're innocent until you're proven guilty, and we need to be careful, particularly in recent years, the advent of social media and the rest of it, that somehow people are guilty and need to prove their innocence. That is not how our system operates, regardless of who you are. We don't find guilt before innocence, and this is not a judge and jury process.
It's interesting how he's all for the concept of not being able to take any action against Scott Morrison, because you're innocent until proven guilty. This is despite a former senior judge making adverse findings against Morrison in a Royal Commission. But on the other hand, he was very quick to kick Senator David Van out of the Liberal Party when allegations of inappropriate conduct surfaced about him, without a judge or jury being involved. I guess it's just the case that Robodebt and its implications on countless Australians isn't an issue of political consequence for a large chunk of voters. And that is a sad fact. Thank you for watching. These videos are only possible because of supporters signed up to Patreon. If you want to help support this channel grow, please consider checking out my Patreon page. Link is in the description.